Romans chapter 4, verse 16. Therefore, it is of faith. See, the law works wrath, which is why God justifies by faith. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So let's start with the first part of that verse. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace. God justifies on the basis of faith, so that He justifies by grace rather than works. That's why God chose faith. Faith is a non-meritorious belief system. In other words, can you say, look at me. I believe Christ died for my sins. I mean, can you boast in that? I mean, the only thing, you can't boast in that because the only thing you did is sin a lot, realize you were desperate and hopeless, and trusted the Lord Jesus Christ to save you. You can hardly brag about that. Justification by grace and faith go together, because grace has nothing to do with your works, and when you're justified by faith, it's not because of any merit or accomplishment of your own. Faith is not a work that you can brag about, in other words. And I'll add to that, sadly, that's why more people aren't saved. See, you can't brag about faith. You can brag about giving to the poor. You can brag about keeping the law. You can brag about being a good person. And when most people think about their relationship with God, they have this idea of the scales of justice. And my good outweigh my bad. Yeah, I'm not perfect, but my good is more than my bad. You're kidding yourself. You're kidding yourself. How many sins do you have to commit to spend eternity in the lake of fire? And the answer is one. So the silliness of my good outweighs my bad, first of all, it doesn't. Even if it did, you still have plenty of bad. It's reality. If justification was on the basis of works, where what people could do is they could give to the poor, or they could give to charity, or they could do some good deeds, and they could say, look at me, there'd be a lot more people saved. The problem is what faith does, what justification by grace says, is everything you think you can boast in, it's all worthless. That's why Paul calls his preaching the offense of the cross. It's the offense of the cross because you know what it says about man's righteousness and self-justification and self-aggrandizement? It's all baloney. It's all baloney. Romans 4:16, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed. Here's the idea of this. The promise is made sure because it's of faith that it might be by grace. Put it this way. What if God said to Abraham, your descendants are going to enjoy all the promises I've made to you, and all they have to do is keep the Old Testament law? What would Abraham say? Well, okay, thanks, but they're not going to be able to do that, so thanks for nothing. I mean, isn't that true? God says, I'll give you all these blessings. All you have to do is keep the Old Testament law. Well, there's no hope I have of doing that. So what God did is He made it sure. He made it certain. He made it achievable because it's just by faith. And all you have to do is have faith and you will receive the promises. Now notice what it then says. Not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So God's promise is not only to those who receive the Old Testament law, which would be Israel, but it's everyone who has the faith of Abraham. It's very similar to what we looked at in terms of God made Abraham a father of many nations. So all those who are of faith can obtain that blessing. Look with me at Romans 4:17. as it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations, before him whom he believed, even God who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which be not as though they were. So we see that Abraham is a father of many nations. It's not simply Israel. And then what it says there is, he calleth those things which be not as though they were. Get with me, Acts chapter 15 and verse 18. Acts chapter 15 and verse 18. Acts 15, verse 18. Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. The reason why God calleth those things which be not as though they were, does he know everything that's going to happen? Does he know its timing? Does he know it with certainty? I'll give you the simple illustration to prove that point. In the Old Testament, when someone would bring an animal sacrifice and God would grant them forgiveness at that time, how could he do that? Because Hebrews says it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. So someone shows up, pursuant to Leviticus 4, they show up to the temple, they offer an animal sacrifice, and Leviticus 4 says that they received atonement and forgiveness by offering that sacrifice. Well, how does that work? Because the blood of bulls and goats isn't enough to pay for a man's sin. Well, the reason why is God calleth those things which be not as though they were. So did God look at that person's heart? He knew they had faith because they were offering the animal sacrifices they were commanded. And what he did is he granted them forgiveness because he knew with 100% certainty that Jesus Christ would ultimately offer the sacrifice that would pay for their sin. In other words, God's observing that. He knows the blood of bulls and goats doesn't accomplish anything. But what he does is he looks at the man doing that and says, you have faith in what I have said to you, and my son is going to provide the perfect sacrifice, and I know it's going to happen. So I'm just going to go ahead and forgive you. Isn't that profound? See, what I've found in life is people tell me things, and I wait for them to do them. Do you know why? Because people tell you things that they ultimately decide not to do. If you've lived more than like 12 seconds, you're aware of this, right? God doesn't operate that way because God knows the end from the beginning. He had 100% certainty that Jesus Christ would be faithful to accomplish what he was set out to do, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And so when someone offered an animal sacrifice, God just counted it for forgiveness at that very moment.